Chapter 7, page 27. For 3 years, Ikamafuna lived in Okwanko's household, and the elders of Mofia seemed to have forgotten about him. He was like an elder brother to Nioi and seemed to have kindled a new fire in the younger boy. He made him feel grown up, and they no longer spent the evenings in Mother's hut, but now sat with Okwanko in his hut. Nothing pleased Nioi now more than to be sent for by his mother to do one of those difficult and masculine tasks such as splitting wood or pounding food. On receiving such a message, Nioi would pretend to be annoyed and grumbled aloud about women and their troubles. Okwanko was inwardly pleased at his son's development, and he knew it was because of Ikamafuna. Okwanko wanted Nioi to grow into a tough young man. He wanted him to be prosperous with enough food in his barn to feed the ancestors with sacrifices. And so Okwanko was always happy when he heard Nioi grumbling about women. That showed in time he would be able to control his womenfolk. No matter how prosperous a man was, if he was unable to rule his women and children, he was not really a man. Okwanko encouraged the boys to sit with him, and he told them masculine stories of violence and bloodshed. Nioi knew it was right to be violent, but he still preferred the stories his mothers used to tell, stories of the tortoise and his wily ways, and of the bird who challenged the world to a wrestling contest. He remembered the story of the quarrel between earth and sky. When Nioi's mother sang this song, he felt carried to distant scenes. These were the stories Nioi loved, but he now knew they were for foolish women and children, and he knew his father wanted him to be a man. So he pretended he no longer cared for women's stories. He could see his father was pleased because Okwanko no longer beat him. So Nioi and Ikamafuna would listen to Okwanko's stories of tribal wars, and as he told them of the past, they sat in darkness or the dim glow of logs, waiting for the women to finish cooking. And when they finished, each brought her bowl of fufu and bowl of soup to her husband. An oil lamp was lit, and Okwanko tasted from each bowl, and then he passed 2 shares to Nioi and Ikamafuna. In this way moons and seasons passed. Then the locusts came. It had not happened for many a year. The elders said the locusts came once in a generation. They came in the cold season after the harvest had been gathered and ate up all the wild grass. Then the elders said they went back to their caves in a distant land where they were guarded by a race of stunted men. Okwanko and the 2 boys were working on the red outer walls of the compound. This was one of the lighter tasks of the after-harvest season. A new cover of thick palm leaves was set on the walls to protect them from the next rainy season. The women had gone to the bush to collect firewood. The little children had gone to visit their playmates in other compounds. Okwanko and the boys worked in silence, which was broken only when a new palm frond was lifted into the wall or when a busy hen moved dry leaves about her in search for food. Then quite suddenly, a shadow fell on the world. Okwanko looked up and wondered if it was going to rain at such an unlikely time of year. But almost immediately, a shout of joy broke out. "Locusts are descending!" was joyfully chanted everywhere, and men, women, and children left their work or their play and ran into the open to see the unfamiliar sight. The locusts had not come for many years, and only the old people had seen them before. At first, a fairly small swarm came. Then appeared a slowly moving mass, like a boundless sheet of black cloud. Soon it covered half the sky. It was a tremendous sight of beauty and power. Everyone was now about, talking excitedly and praying that the locusts should camp at Umofia for the night. Although the locusts had not visited for many years, everybody knew they were very good to eat. At last the locusts did descend. They descended on the roofs and covered the ground. Mighty tree branches broke under them, and the country became the brown color of the vast swarm. Many people went out with baskets trying to catch them, but the elders counseled patience until nightfall. And they were right. The locusts settled in the bushes and their wings became wet with dew. Then everyone filled bags and pots with locusts. The next morning they were roasted in clay pots and spread in the sun until they became dry. For many days this rare food was eaten with palm oil. Okonkwo sat in his hut, crunching happily with Ikemafuno and Nioi and drinking palm wine. When Ebugwezi Izuedo came in, Izuedo was the eldest man in this part of Umuofia. He had been a great and fearless warrior, and he was now accorded great respect. He refused to join the meal, and he asked Okonkwo to have a word with him outside. When they were out of earshot, he said to Okonkwo, "That boy calls you father. Do not bear a hand in his death. Yes, Umuofia has decided to kill him. The Oracle of the Hills and Caves has pronounced it. They will take him outside Umuofia, as is the custom, and kill him there. But I want you to have nothing to do with it, because he calls you his father." The next day, a group of elders from all the 9 villages Umuofia came to Okonkwo's house early in the morning. Nioi and Ikemafuno were sent out. The elders did not stay long, but when they went away, Okonkwo sat for a long time. Later that day, he called Ikemafuno and told him that he was to be taken home the next day. Nioi overheard and burst into tears, whereupon his father beat him heavily. As for Ikemafuno, he was at a loss. His own home had gradually become faint and distant. He still missed his mother and sister, but somehow he knew he was not going to see them. He remembered when men had talked in low tones with his father, and now it seemed it was happening all over again. Later, Nioi went to his mother's hut and told her that Ikemafuno was going home. She folded her arms and sighed, "Ah, poor child." The next day the men returned with a pot of wine. They were all dressed as if they were going to a big clan meeting. Okonkwo got ready quickly, and the party set out with Ikemafuno carrying the pot of wine. A deathly silence descended on Okonkwo's compound. Even the very little children seemed to know. Throughout that day, Nioi sat in his mother's hut, and tears filled his eyes. At the beginning of the journey, the men of Umuofia laughed about the locusts and their women. But as they left Umuofia, silence fell upon them too. The footway had become a narrow line in the heart of the forest. The undergrowth gave way to giant trees untouched by the axe and the bushfire. The sun threw a pattern of light and shade on the footway. Thus the men of Umuofia pursued their way, armed with sheathed machetes, and Ikemafuno, carrying a pot of palm wine on his head, walked in their midst. He was not afraid now. Okonkwo walked behind him. He could hardly imagine that Okonkwo was not his real father. He had never been fond of his real father, but his mother and 3-year-old sister. Of course, she would be 6 now. Would he recognize her? She must have grown quite big. How his mother would weep for joy and thank Okonkwo for having looked after him so well. He would tell her about Nioi and his mother and about the locusts. Then quite suddenly a thought came upon him. His mother might be dead. He tried in vain to force the thought out of his mind. Then he tried to settle the matter by singing a song and walking to its beat. If the song ended on the right foot, his mother was alive. If it ended on his left, she was dead. One of the men behind him cleared his throat. Ikemafuno looked back, and the man growled at him to go on. The way he said it, sent cold fear down Ikemafuno's back. His hands trembled vaguely on the black pot he carried. Why had Okonkwo withdrawn to the rear? Ikemafuno felt his legs melting under him. He was afraid to look back. As the man who had cleared his throat drew up and raised his machete, Okonkwo looked away. He heard the blow. The pot fell and broke in the sand. He heard Ikemafuno cry, "My father! They have killed me!" And as he ran towards him, dazed with fear, Okonkwo drew his machete and cut Ikemafuno down. He was afraid of being thought weak. As soon as his father walked in, Nioi knew that Ikomafuna had been killed, and something seemed to give away inside of him, like the snapping of a tightened bow. He did not cry. He just hung limp. He had just the same kind of feeling not long ago during the last harvest season. Every child loved the harvest season if they could not help digging up the yams. They could gather firewood for roasting, the ones that would be eaten there on the farm. It was after such a day that Nioi had felt for the first time a snapping inside him, like the one he now felt. They were returning home when they heard the voice of an infant crying in the thick forest. A sudden hush had fallen over the women, who had been talking, and they quickened their steps. Nioi heard that twins were put in earthenware pots and thrown away in the forest, but he had never come across them. A vague chill had descended on him. Then something had given way inside him. It came on him again, this feeling when his father walked in, that night, after killing Ikomafuna. Think about the different cultures and the reasons why they do what they do in their village.